And on that day, the first little African-American child
Yes.
to go on a ride at that amusement park was a little 11-month-old girl, Sharon Langley, who was there with her mom and her dad. And she rode the park's merry-go-round.
Yes.
And so my book points out
That's right.
something that I first read about this incident in a really interesting book called Here Lies Jim Crow by
Yes.
C. Fraser Smith.
That's right.
But that book didn't mention what had happened to the merry-go-round. So
Right.
I did some research, and I found out that the merry-go-round is now on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., just a short walk from the Lincoln Memorial where Dr. King gave his speech. So
Right.
it just struck me that all these things are symbols that we
Right.
shouldn't forget.
That's right.
We
Yes.
shouldn't forget.
Sure.
We shouldn't forget what happened at Gwynn Oak Park 50
That's
years
right.
ago. And when you take your kids to go to visit your
The
trip to
right.
the
The
Washington,
memorial.
D.C.,
That's right.
look for that
Yes.
merry-go-round because
That's right.
it played a part.
Yeah. Let's talk about, as you mentioned, core men such as the Honorable Walter P. Carter, that I've
Right.
often said sometimes is written out of history in terms of not just what he symbolizes, but again, how
What
you
he-
talked about the importance of how they were able to come together, using
Right.
him coming out of the military, coming from the South, and then, of course, working with the students and then working with other peoples of all walks of life, black, brown, red, yellow, and white, in order to bring about, again, dismantling the walls of, again, Jim Crow and segregation around
Right.
Gwynn Oak Park.
Right, I was very lucky to be able to interview some people who actually worked with Walter P. Carter, and he was the head of CORE from 1961 to 63, but was active in CORE afterwards and in housing issues and for many years. Fortunately, he died much too young,
Yes.
and everyone... the people I talked to all said that he was Mr. Baltimore Civil Rights.
That's right.
And, he
Yeah.
was the Martin Luther King of Baltimore.
That's right.
And the people that I interviewed who worked with him and knew him said that he was a tactician.
Yes.
He was able to think. What I
That's
said,
right.
how do you find the
Right.
way to pressure people
That's
to
right.
do the right thing?
Yes.
John Romer, who was one of the people who worked with him, that's something that he likes to say, is that he learned from Walter P. Carter how to think outside the box.
That's right.
How to find different ways to bring pressure to end this terrible situation. And they didn't just work on Gwynn Oak Amusement Park.
Right.
They mounted sit-ins in restaurants up and down Route 40, down
That's right.
Eastern Shore, Western Maryland.
Right.
Always trying to find the way to bring an end to this. And
Yes, ma'am. That's right.
So there's a wonderful documentary that was
Right.
made by him about him recently, Walter Carter, called Walter Carter, Champion of Change. Which,
Right.
it was shown on
Champion Change or Champion of Courage, I think.
Yeah, it was.
on,
It was shown
MPT.
on the
Right.
Maryland Public Television, and his is a story not to be forgotten.
Yes, ma'am. Talk about how, again, and family, if you're just tuning in, we'll open up the line shortly. Take maybe thoughts, questions, or comments you may have for Miss Nathan,
Yeah.
and talk about how they can obtain a copy of this book as well.
Yeah.
And as I've been asking you, of course, will the book be available in Braille for many of my visually impaired listeners out there?
Boy, if anybody knows how to do that,
Yes,
I'd be
ma'am.
glad.
Also making it available on DVD as well, an audio book. But got to ask, talk about how this became for you, because as a young white growing up in the city of Baltimore, oftentimes, your parents didn't want you to get involved in these kind of movements, So talk about how it was even for you, an educational experience in doing this book, but also during that time as well, growing up in Baltimore City.
Well, I was very lucky growing up in Baltimore. Baltimore at that time, neighborhoods were quite isolated, and you lived in one neighborhood and you didn't have much mixing with other
Right.
neighborhoods. But I was lucky to go to Western High School, all girls public high school, which was, I guess now you would call it a magnet school. So
Right.
it drew students from all over the Baltimore area, and through the magic of going to Western High School, I met students from neighborhoods quite different from my own, and
Right.
Became sort of a peripheral part of groups of students who were becoming active in the civil rights movement. I was just sort of a peripheral part of this, but and yes, and one of my great regrets in my life is that I knuckled under to my parents' fears and did not go to the March on Washington that summer. They were fearful, and it was in fact a dangerous time, as I learned as I did the research for the book. But I was that summer I was working with a group called the Northern Students Movement, which was setting up tutoring facilities in Baltimore. So, and then I went away to college and was no longer under the thumb of my parents. So.
Right.
But
right.
no, working on this book has been an incredible experience and learning what was really going on in Baltimore when I grew up, because I knew only just a small slice of
right.
what it was. And reading the back newspaper issues and magazines and oral histories at the Maryland Historical Society, and then interviewing, as I was lucky to do, with so many people who took part in these events. It has just been an eye-opening experience, and I tried to put it all together in this book so other people can share this experience, learning that protest against discrimination and segregation is going on in Baltimore from the 1930s on, before even.
That's right.
My
yes.
book, I start chronicling it from about 30 on, and it was a very impressive story. And yeah.
Yes.
So I just want to point out to people
Please.
who might have memories of Gwynn Oak or want to know more about it, that we're planning a very large celebration on July 7th at the site of the old Gwynn Oak Park in Woodlawn. It's Gwynn Oak Park, you can find it.
Right.
It's right off
Sure.
of Liberty Road.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to install this historical marker that I was telling you about that's going to point out what happened there 50 years ago. There are going to be speeches, entertainment, music, food, to commemorate the courage and the bravery of the people who
right.
had the courage to stand up
yes.
and fight for the end of segregation at this park and other things that
that's right.
And not just this park, but
the park, right? But
all the people, all the
that's right,
events.
and all of the events that were interconnected
right.
Around the issue.
So 63 was an important year in Baltimore. That's when we all just were celebrating the
right.
Northwood movie theater
right.
protests, and so I hope people can come out and
yes.
and sort of try to rekindle this spirit of people coming together and working together to solve big problems.
Yeah, it has to happen. Yeah. Talk about some of the other names. I know we mentioned the Honorable Walter P. Carter, but you talked about Mr. Chance. We talked
Ed
about
Chance,
others that were part of this again, and religious leaders, because they had to come out of their comfort zone and take those kind of stances as well.
Right.
And sometimes they would probably get a letter or get a reprimand from those that were over top of them,
right.
or even from some of their congregation members that
right.
didn't understand the type of stance they were taking. But talk about Mr. Chance and some of the others.
Yeah,
please.
Ed Chance was he took Walter Carter was the head of Baltimore Corps from 61 to 63, and he had been arrested so many times. And as he told the Baltimore Sun that nonviolent protest is very effective, but it's very expensive if you keep getting arrested and are trying to hold down a regular job and support your family. So
that's right.
He stepped down from being the sort of the day-to-day president, and Ed Chance, who was a fellow social worker
mm-hmm.
in the Baltimore area, he took over and he organized the actual July demonstrations at the park. But Walter Carter was helping in the background, and then he organized the Maryland participation in the March on Washington. But yes, there was a large outpouring of support of religious leaders, and that was what helped get
mm-hmm.
These July 63 protests their good press coverage, because nationally known clergy came down from New York and Connecticut and got photographed. Reverend Eugene Carson Blake, who at that time was the head of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, photographs of him on the front page of the New York Times, being put in a paddy wagon, arrested on July 4th at Gwynn Oak.
Right.
That made an impression on
yes.
the national scene. But there were many clergy from the Baltimore area as well. Rabbi Mara Lieberman of Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, the Catholic, the Archdiocese,
right.
The Archbishop assigned an official representative to the Planning Commission. The second day of protests on July 7th, nearly half the protesters were members of Catholic parishes that came as groups
yes.
to the demonstration. Protestant ministers, the clergy from and congregations all over the city, and it was a religious participation and the arrest of more than 20 clergy.
Mm-hmm.
This was the first in the civil rights movement,
right.
the first time that such a large number of clergy were arrested at one single demonstration.
That's right.
That helped make headlines and always get the press attention.
Yes.
And but it was a brave thing these clergy did. So I just gave a talk where I met Darren.
Yes, that's right.
At my old church in Hunting Ridge Presbyterian, and I did a little extra research for that talk about some of the clergy that took part. And one was the minister of the church across the street from my church, St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church, and that was Reverend Jack Malpas, and there's actually a picture of him in the book,
yes,
Father Jack. And one of the people who was at the talk that I gave in March in Hunting Ridge reminisced that the Reverend Malpas preached about his participation in his arrest the following Sunday in 1963, and people in the congregation got up and walked out. So it was in Rabbi Morris Lieberman's congregation, there was also backlash, criticism of him for stepping outside the rabbinic role,
right,
and taking a stand in a social issue, engaging in civil disobedience. Maybe wasn't thought that was the proper role for a clergyman.
That's right.
The Catholic Church, a lot of protest against, and so that the Archbishop had to announce that from then on, if any priests wanted to take part in civil rights protests, they had to first get permission to do so.
Yes.
The permission would be granted, but so that there was a backlash. So the stand that they took in '63, that was a
right,
courageous stand. I mean, it
yes,
might seem to us today, well, of course you would
right,
do that, but that wasn't necessarily the thinking of everyone in their congregations. So these clergymen
yes,
made a bold move.
That's right. Again, family, if you're just tuning in, having a conversation with Miss Amy, again, Nathan, author of the book Round and Round Together, talking about the desegregation of Gwynn Oak Park. We'll open up the lines. Take your thoughts, questions, and or comments at 410-761-1592. And before we do that, got to ask you, of course, what do you hope that young people who may not know the history of Gwynn Oak Park, and perhaps some adults who have forgotten the true history of Gwynn Oak Park, gain out of reading this book?
Well, I think that what's really important is to see there's a Baltimore connection to this most important event of civil rights history, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom,
right,
August 28th, 1963, where the I Have a Dream speech was delivered. That's like everybody learns about that in school, but to realize that there was this local connection to that day, and the same thing was going on here, and that it wasn't just segregation wasn't ended just from a few famous people.
That's right.
It was the hard work of many people in Baltimore, in cities all across the South, and in the border states, and in North too. That it was a lot of foot soldiers.
That's right.
And so that gets the message across that if you see some problem that needs to be solved,
as Dr. King said, right?
Just it's time to step up and try to work on it. So that it's a way of having a link to history, but also an example to follow.
That's right. And with that, let me come to the lines. 410-761-1592. Good afternoon, caller. You're on the State of the City.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I wanted to direct my question to Miss Amy. I wanted to know if your book covers the facility at Gwynn Oak that I think was known as a ballroom.
Oh, the Dixie Ballroom, yeah.
Yes. And from what I remember as a little girl, there were several social groups, political groups that were denied access to hold functions there. I do remember being denied entry as a little girl just to play in the area of the park, but I wasn't old enough to really use the ballroom. So I wanted to know if your book went into great detail about that, because that was something that I remember from my childhood of groups being denied access to that facility.
Right. The ballroom was
Thank
part
you for
of
your call.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, the Dixie Ballroom was part of the park, and so yes, it was off limits too. I think there were the whole park was off limits. You might have seen the park. If you saw the first Hairspray movie, did you see the first? John Waters sort of takes a lot of artistic license, but he sort of based the amusement park in the first Hairspray movie on Gwynn Oak, and the whole park. I think there was one year where the Hopkins it was wanted to have its dance for their senior prom, and when they found that it was off limits, they canceled the prom there. But
Yes, ma'am. Talk about, if we could, and again, family, just tuned in, having a conversation with Miss